Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura. Today we are going to talk about something that has quietly become the most consequential fight in artificial intelligence. And it has almost nothing to do with models.
I love that framing because I think most people who follow this industry are still watching benchmark scores and model launches, when the real story right now is playing out in obscure regional grid auctions and state utility commission dockets that almost nobody reads.
So let's set the stage properly. There is a regional grid operator called PJM Interconnection, and it manages the flow of electricity for roughly 67 million Americans across the Mid-Atlantic and a good chunk of the Midwest. It is the largest grid operator in the country.
And PJM runs something called a capacity auction, which is genuinely one of the strangest and most important markets in America. It is not an auction for electricity itself. It is an auction for the promise that a power plant will be available and ready on the worst day of the year.
That distinction matters a lot, and I want to make sure listeners really internalize it. You are not buying power. You are buying insurance. You are paying generators to sit there, fueled and staffed and ready in case demand spikes and the grid needs them immediately.
Exactly right. And the price of that insurance just did something extraordinary. The auction covering the 2028 to 2029 delivery year was held from June 30th through July 7th of this year, and it cleared at $325 per megawatt-day.
Now, that number by itself means nothing to a normal human being, so give us the context. Is $325 per megawatt-day a big number, a small number, or somewhere comfortably in the middle of historical norms?
It is not just a big number, it is the ceiling. $325 per megawatt-day is the administrative price cap. The market did not settle at that price because supply and demand happened to meet there. It settled there because it hit a wall and could go no higher.
That is a genuinely alarming detail, and I want to sit with it for a second. When a market clears exactly at its cap, that tells you the cap is the only thing standing between ratepayers and whatever the true clearing price would have been.
And we actually know what that true price would have been, because the analysis has been published. Without the cap in place, the auction would have cleared at $554.72 per megawatt-day across most of the footprint. That is roughly 70% higher.
So the cap saved ratepayers from a 70% worse outcome, which sounds like good news until you realize that the price cap does not create electricity. It just hides the shortage. What actually happened to supply in that auction?
This is the part that should worry people most. The auction secured 136,318 megawatts of capacity. PJM's own reliability standard required more than that. They came up 6,831 megawatts short of their own target.
All right, so who is responsible for this demand surge? I want to be careful here because it would be easy and lazy to blame everything on artificial intelligence when grids have plenty of other pressures, including electrification of heating and transportation.
That is a fair instinct, and I appreciate you pushing on it. But PJM's own independent market monitor did the attribution work, and the finding was specific. Of the $16.4 billion in total capacity cost, roughly $0.3 billion is attributable to data centers.
$6.3 billion out of $16.4 billion. So data centers are responsible for something on the order of 38% of the entire cost of keeping that grid reliable, and they are a relatively new entrant to that demand picture.
And here's the detail that makes this really contentious. Ratepayers are not just paying for capacity to serve data centers that exist today. They are paying for capacity reserved to serve speculative load, meaning projects that have been announced and queued but may never actually get built.
Okay, that is the crux of it for me. If a developer files an interconnection request for a very large facility, the grid operator has to plan around that request, procure capacity for it, and charge everyone for that procurement, even if the project quietly dies later.
You have put your finger on exactly the structural flaw that regulators are now scrambling to fix. The interconnection queue was designed for a world where large industrial loads were rare, slow-moving, and reasonably certain. None of those three assumptions describe the current environment at all.
So what does this actually mean for a household? Because grid economics can feel very abstract until it shows up on a piece of paper in your mailbox, with a number at the bottom that is bigger than it used to be.
The Natural Resources Defense Council ran the numbers, and their projection for an average household in PJM territory is a bill increase of roughly $70 per month by 2028 compared with pre-surge levels. That is real money for most families.
And is that pressure showing up in actual wholesale markets yet? Or is this still mostly forecasting that could easily turn out wrong, the way a great many energy predictions historically have turned out wrong?
It is already showing up. Demand-weighted wholesale electricity prices have risen somewhere between 6 and 29% on average nationally, and in the hardest-hit regions, the increase has been as much as 57%. That is observed data, not projection.
Let me play devil's advocate for a moment, because there is a counter-argument here that I think deserves a fair hearing. Large industrial loads have historically been good for ratepayers because they spread fixed grid costs across a much bigger base of consumption.
That is a completely legitimate point, and for a long time it was true of data centers specifically. Fortune ran an analysis a couple of weeks ago showing that data centers had actually been pushing electricity costs down for years before this cycle began.
So what broke the pattern? If large, steady loads used to lower everyone's bills, something specific must have changed about either the scale, the speed, or the certainty of these particular facilities coming online.
All three changed simultaneously, which is why the old intuition stopped working. The scale is roughly a $7 trillion buildout. The speed outruns any permitting or construction cycle for generation. And critically, there is no guaranteed demand underneath it to justify the capacity.
That last point is the one that keeps me up at night, honestly. If the AI demand materializes as forecast, the infrastructure gets used and the economics eventually work out. If it does not, ratepayers have financed enormous stranded capacity for facilities that never filled up.
And unlike an investor in a company, a ratepayer never agreed to take that risk. Nobody in Ohio or Pennsylvania signed up to be a venture capitalist in the artificial intelligence build-out, but through their utility bill, that is functionally what has happened to them.
So let's talk about the response, because governments have clearly noticed. The most dramatic move I've seen came out of New York, and I want you to walk us through exactly what the governor did and what it actually covers.
Governor Kathy Hochul signed Executive Order Number 62, which established the first statewide moratorium on hyperscale data centers anywhere in the United States. It pauses certain state environmental permits for up to 1 year while agencies build a regulatory framework.
A 1-year pause is a serious intervention in a market moving this fast. What is the threshold for a facility to fall under it? Because presumably this is not aimed at a small server closet in an office building somewhere upstate.
The threshold is 50 megawatts or more of energy consumption, which is squarely aimed at hyperscale facilities and leaves ordinary commercial computing entirely alone. And notably, the executive order arrived roughly 1 month after the state legislature had already passed a similar moratorium.
That sequencing is interesting because it suggests this was not one official acting alone on an impulse. You had a legislature and an executive independently arriving at the same conclusion within about 30 days of each other, which signals real political consensus.
And the governor's stated reasoning was refreshingly plain. Her argument was that technology companies are flooding the zone with applications faster than states and localities can evaluate them, and that small communities genuinely do not know how to assess what is being proposed to them.
I find that argument hard to dismiss. A town of 8,000 people with a part-time planning board is not equipped to evaluate a proposal that will consume more electricity than the entire surrounding county currently uses on a summer afternoon.
Right? And that capacity mismatch between the sophistication of the applicant and the sophistication of the reviewer is exactly what a temporary pause is designed to address. It buys time to build institutional competence rather than making permanent decisions under pressure.
Now, a moratorium is the blunt instrument. What is the more surgical policy tool that regulators are reaching for? Because I assume most states do not want to simply turn away billions of dollars in capital investment.
The surgical tool is called a large load tariff, and it is spreading remarkably fast. It is essentially a special rate class that requires very large customers to pay the true cost of serving them through long-term contracts, substantial collateral deposits, and dedicated infrastructure charges.
So instead of banning the facility, you make the facility financially responsible for the grid upgrades it triggers. That seems like a much more durable answer than a pause, assuming the tariffs are actually designed well enough to hold up.
And the adoption numbers are striking. As of May of this year, 23 states had approved at least one large load tariff, with another 7 states having tariffs pending before their commissions. That is 60% of the country moving in one direction.
What about the grid operator itself? PJM is sitting in the middle of this, catching criticism from every direction. Have they proposed anything structural, or are they mostly waiting for regulators and legislators to hand them new rules?
They have actually proposed 2 significant things. Their board put forward a backstop capacity auction, which would let them procure additional supply outside the normal cycle, and separately, a set of data center curtailment plans that would reduce large load consumption during genuine emergencies.
The curtailment piece is fascinating to me because it essentially converts data centers from firm load into something more flexible. If a facility can power down or shift work during the 60 worst hours of the year, the capacity math changes completely.
It changes dramatically, and this is where the technology and the policy genuinely intersect. A training run can often be paused or relocated. A hospital or a residential heating system cannot. Treating those two loads identically was always an accident of how the rules were originally written.
There is also a federal dimension developing, which I think a lot of people have missed because it is buried in legislative language that nobody outside energy law would ever voluntarily read on a weekday afternoon.
There is, and it matters. There is a bill that would amend the Federal Power Act to clarify that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has jurisdiction over the interconnection of very large loads directly to interstate transmission, defining large as a projected peak demand of 100 megawatts or more.
So let me try to synthesize where this leaves us, because we have covered a lot of ground and I want listeners to walk away with a clear picture rather than just a pile of alarming numbers.
Please do, and I will push back if I think you are being too tidy about it, because I do not think there is a clean resolution available here in the next couple of years, no matter what anybody does.
Here's my read. The compute build-out is real, the demand for electricity is real, and the grid cannot expand fast enough to absorb it. That means somebody pays a premium, and right now the default rules assign that premium to ordinary ratepayers.
I agree with that framing entirely, and I would add one thing. The reason this is becoming a political story rather than purely a technical one is that the beneficiaries and the payers are completely different populations, with no overlap whatsoever.
So what should someone actually watch over the next several months if they want to know which way this goes, rather than just absorbing whatever headline happens to cross their feed on a given morning?
Watch 3 specific things. Watch whether the New York moratorium gets extended or converted into permanent standards. Watch whether large load tariffs survive the inevitable legal challenges from developers. And watch the next capacity auction to see whether supply finally responds to price.
That third one is the real test, isn't it? A price signal is only useful if it eventually produces supply. If the next auction clears at the cap again with another shortfall, we will know the market design itself is broken.
That is exactly the diagnostic, and I would be lying if I told you I was confident about the answer. Building generation and transmission takes years, and the demand curve is moving on a timeline measured in quarters. Those two clocks do not match.
Which is maybe the most honest place to end. The bottleneck for artificial intelligence right now is not algorithms, it is not chips, and it is not talent. It is steel in the ground and copper on towers, moving at the speed of permitting.
And that is a genuinely humbling thing for an industry that has spent several years believing it could simply out-engineer any constraint it encountered. Physics and permitting are two adversaries that do not particularly care how clever your architecture happens to be.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.